really important thing a composer needs to be able to do is to be able to step back off of this piece they've been obsessing over and observe the piece as an audience member just hearing it for the first time. I do think that the piece is already there. It's just a matter of uncovering it. The most important thing for composers is to have community. Relationships determine results.
Welcome, David.
Thank you so much.
So when I was looking at your family tree, I was amazed. I mean, when you grew up, you were listening to Beatles with your sister and casually going to Carnegie Hall to check your grandfather, Rudolf Serkin's classical music. What was some of the important thing that you think you were being influenced from him?
So my grandfather was even though he died when I was a teenager, he was a profound influence on me, not just in his life, but after in his death. Music was so important to him that in a way he lives on in his recordings, in his students. But growing up, he was just a wonderful grandfather, lots of fun. But something I always noticed was even when he would totally clown around, and the moment music started playing, he would stop and focus. It showed me how important music was to him.
I mean, he's so great as an interpreter for Beethoven and Schubert. When I was studying classical at NEC, I always check his video. So he had great influence, I think, especially for our generation of the young pianists. So do you think that was those moments shape you like the composer you are nowadays?
He passed away, I guess it was 1991, so before the internet, before YouTube or anything else. He did make some great recordings with George Sell and Leonard Bernstein, many others, Seiji Ozawa. When my grandfather was very young, he studied with Schoenberg, and he studied composition and also contemporary music. And he always had relationships with composers. Martinu wrote a piano sonata for him, but that wasn't his focus. His focus was really the literature of music. My uncle Peter, on the other hand, was very much invested really in all music, but spent a lot of time working on new music and working with composers as well. And then my great grandfather, Adolf Busch, was also a composer and very well known as a composer. He's known much more as a violinist today. Yeah. He had incredible principles. And so when I was younger, when I was in school, it definitely got into my head a lot because, coming from a family like that is intimidating even, and it plays, I think, games with your mind as you're trying to learn music and get better at what you do. Despite those kind of emotional struggles, I'm very grateful to come from the family I come from because now that I'm older, um, I feel a tremendous amount of warmth and respect for the people that came before me in my family. Adolf Busch died a long time before I was born, but my uncle Peter just passed away a few years ago, and he was a very, very important person in my life.
Did you self-taught your music?
I started composing when I was 8 years old, but I didn't get really serious about it until high school. And like many people, I had a good music teacher in high school, not very aware of new music necessarily, but taught me some fundamentals that was helpful. I was self-taught, but I took a lot of different lessons. I started with percussion when I was 5 or 6, and then the teacher quit because he asked me why I wanted to learn percussion, and I said to annoy my mother. And he said, so you could just play tuba then? And I said, that's a great idea. So he quit. Then I studied cello for a while. I landed on classical guitar, really was mostly my instrument. Coming from the family I do, the piano had a certain symbolism to me early on, so I can plunk around on it, but that's about it. Did a lot of singing and conducting as well.
How was your high school before 12 years old?
Well, I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania called Doylestown, which has grown a lot since then and become a lot more worldly and a lot more empathy there. But when I was growing up there, it was still a small town and pretty rural.
It was famous for like impressionist activity.
That's true. That area. Wow, you've done your research. So that area has had some great arts, and in Doylestown, Rodgers and Hammerstein and some others. The pop star Pink comes from Doylestown, so it's not the middle of nowhere. But it was when I was growing up there. It was a pretty small. So I'm Jewish, and we always hid that identity there because I think it wouldn't have been accepted. So I had an opportunity to come to New York. My sister, my JJ, was teaching at Columbia Preparatory School here on 93rd Street. I got to come here. She became my legal guardian, and she raised me actually for all of high school. Much more strict than my mother, I have to say. It was incredible, coming here to New York, being around the museums, being around, I mean, I look out the window here, there's the Metropolitan Opera. I got to go there in high school and hear rehearsals. So for me, it was like walking out of a desert and jumping into the ocean.
So it's not the fish out of water circumstance. You really rock the city.
It took a little time to adjust, but I felt like I really thrived here.
So you have went to so many different schools. You're like the Pokemon, but for school collectors.
I did have to catch them all, and I almost did.
Like Julia Curtis, Oberlin, University of Pennsylvania for PhD.
MSM, University of Vienna.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 6, I think. So a lot of composers are kind of professional students early on, and the reason is, if you're a 20-year-old violinist, you might have an idea of what your career trajectory will be. Are you winning competitions? Are you thinking about this or that? A composer is just starting out at the age of 20. So we need a community. We need an environment to grow. School is that. We meet other musicians. We were speaking earlier. I went to school with Hilary Hahn and Lang Lang. Yuja Wang was one of my students shortly after I started teaching at Curtis. Those people become your friends for life and also your advocates. So a lot of my early commissions came from my colleagues who had gone on to professional careers. So it's very important, if you can as a composer and you're looking for a certain kind of career, to be in school and to have a community. Because when you're out, the world is very cold. But in school, you have musicians you get to know. You have venues and opportunities to hear your music, which is really the most important thing.
Definitely. I think you're shaping the next generations of musicians, and also you're shaping the school culture. For you, what do you think the best environment aside of school might probably help the composers to get thriving?
Something I say, and I didn't invent this, but relationships determine results. In other words, the relationships that you have are what going to determine the outcome of your life, the relationships you build. If you're someone who's difficult to work with, who's negative, who pushes people away, it will be very, very hard to have a career. But if you're someone who's inclusive and welcoming, if we look at people, Yo-Yo Ma is just always, always giving. I just spoke with someone recently who spent a lot of time with Leonard Bernstein, who said, if he had an interest in your work, he was constantly available to you, even though he was so busy. So I think it's very important to build relationships, but also be always willing to give, because it will come back to you as well. So that's a more abstract answer to your question. A more practical answer is stay connected with musicians. Do whatever you can to have your music heard. Never feel that you're above things like self-promotion or being on Instagram and all this kind of thing. Be aware of what the technology of today is and how you can use that for your work. The most important thing for composers is to have community. And when we look at those composers who had success in their lifetimes, they had community. They had people who believed in what they did and supported them.
Great, nice. Because musicians or composers tend to isolate themselves in the practice
Exactly.
rooms. I think that's a very great trait, especially nowadays, for people to pay attention to.
Well, it's hard because as composers, we're very solitary, right? We're alone when we do our work. As a pianist,
We're even more lonely.
you're spending 8 hours in the practice rooms, but you play chamber music. Hopefully, you play chamber music. If you're a violinist, hopefully you're playing chamber music and orchestra in many different settings. So a composer has to really switch gears because we don't get that opportunity unless we're performers. So our practice is always solitary, pretty much. And then we suddenly change direction and have to interact with someone, helping them to play our music.
I mean, you're a very romantic person. You always say that I wrote for people, not for the page, not for the instrument. And then you composed a concerto for your fiance back then, who was an acclaimed violinist, Bella.
Bella, yeah.
Did you have conversation before you composed that work?
Bella Christova is my wife. She's a violinist. She's incredible, plays all over the world. Just when we were getting engaged, a friend, a colleague who's an executive director of an orchestra, it was Vermont Symphony at the time, thought that would be great to do a piece, a consortium commission of, I think it ended up being 8 different orchestras at first, to commission a piece about our marriage. But I thought that was a little narcissistic or a little egotistical to just write about my marriage to Bella. But I did think that there was something really important there about the idea of commitment and empathy, communion, partnership that marriage is supposed to be. Whatever marriage is, whether or not it's an official marriage, but the idea of kind of 2 souls coming together. Okay, here's the story. So Bella never knew her father. Her father died when she was very young. Her parents were never married. And he was a composer, actually, in the Soviet era. So we knew that he had a violin concerto, or we thought he might have. I actually went to the library at Curtis and did an interlibrary loan and found 1 copy of the violin concerto in the United States. So he did write a violin concerto. And they sent it to Curtis. I scanned it. And then I had to send it back. And I took 13 measures from the slow movement and I put it exactly, note for note, in the slow movement of the concerto I was writing for her. Everything. And then I attached the music so it would flow into it and flow out of it. You said I was romantic. So on Valentine's Day, I gave her a thumb drive, which is not a very romantic gift. I know. But she put it in the computer and there was her father's concerto. And she said, wow, you found my father's concerto. And I said, look at the slow movement. So she scrolled and saw it and saw this music she had been practicing already for a month. And I said, this is your father's music. And I put it in our concerto so that it's as if he is a part of our wedding, as if he's observing it. I'll never top that gift. I can get her any piece of jewelry or anything else. How do you beat that? But that was good. So
I mean, that quotation just being ladies.
yeah, I hope so.
So I know that you also work with McGill brothers.
Anthony and Tamari McGill, yeah.
So in those kind of collaborations, how would you start a conversation before you start a conversation?
I've known both of them a very long time. I was at Marlborough with Anthony, and then I was, I knew Damari at Marlborough also. And Anthony and I kind of came up together. He's younger than I am, but we were both at Curtis at the same time. He's very busy. He's all over, but I would send him text messages with, how does this run look? How does this fit? I play a little clarinet too. I played clarinet in a funk band, actually, in college at Oberlin. I know. So luckily it was never recorded. So sometimes, if 2 people are very busy, that's a great thing about technology is that we can just send music to each other and comment on it, because Brahms and Joachim couldn't do that, of course. Not to compare myself to Brahms, of course, but in terms of the stories we know, the world is so small now and we can communicate so easily that I think that helps us in our creating work.
Just go back to your own works. So you have written a highlighted work, Anchoress. So let's talk about that. This piece, when I was listening to it, I was able to tune myself 200% in.
Cool.
If there's a time machine, I would probably go back and experience that. But it was inspiring. It was talking about this medieval Christian who decided herself independently into an emperor called the Catholic Church. And the beginning, it was so striking because there's not much going on, but this spirit and the quietness, it just immediately drew me in, even though I'm not in life. When you start to compose this piece, especially with those less familiar Renaissance band or instruments, the crumhorn, the recorder, how do you really research and apply it?
It's a great question. So this was a commission that came about. A saxophone quartet, the Prism Saxophone Quartet, who I've written a lot for, wanted a piece. But I had gotten a grant from the Independence Foundation in Philadelphia to write something I had never written before. So I chose to write for Renaissance instruments and voice. But my friends in the saxophone quartet said, we want you to write a piece for us. So I thought, what if we have Renaissance instruments and saxophones? It's like the bookends of history in terms of instruments. I'm very interested in the meeting place of the ancient and the contemporary, because I think there's a lot of wisdom to glean from ancient thought, and that we've gone very far in our modern world away from that. So there's a poet I've worked with a lot, very influenced by Katie Ford. Yes, amazing. And she studied theology as well. And so she wrote about these people called anchorites. And anchorites were medieval, so we're talking 1,000 years ago, 600 years ago. As a religious kind of sacrifice, they would pull themselves out of society, and they would actually live in a small room attached to a church with no door either. They would go in, a priest would say last rites. In other words, that's what you say as someone's dying, because they are really leaving the world, leaving their bodies almost, and just becoming spirits, souls. They would build a wall. So that was their lives. There was no door. They couldn't leave. And they had a little slit that they could get food through, and they could see into the church. And I found that very inspiring, that idea of just completely withdrawing from society and inward into your own thoughts. That became a really great basis then to explore the music of ancient Europe, of medieval Europe. What I did was I went and met with the people. It's a group called Pifaro, very well-known group. They're in Philadelphia, and they play these wonderful instruments. And so I sat down with them and took video of every single one of them, something else Brahms could not have done, right? So I took that with me. When I've written for Chinese instruments or Korean instruments, I make sure to document a lot of it. And then I go and listen to lots of music written for those instruments, which is what I did. I listened to all of Pifaro's recordings. I did research about the roles of the instruments and where they would appear in society or in services, in ceremony. So I think it's very important, if you're writing for instruments that are not next to you on a daily basis, to understand where they come from and what they mean culturally as well. It's a matter of respect.
So we have to know the function in society, not just on the stage as a performance.
Exactly.
And I felt that in this piece, each instrument has its own room, and it's not just complicated filled with passages around the notes, but there's such a density in terms of the weighting and air around it. So for those students who have less clue about those elements in terms of pacing, or just not being patient with time, how would you suggest them?
Yeah, timing and pacing is a big thing for us, and time is elastic, right? It gets faster, it gets slower, or maybe it gets faster, it gets slower, either direction. And as composers, we have this incredible ability to affect the way that time is perceived. So a long piece can feel short, a short piece can feel long. For students, I have a lot of questions about writing on the computer, notating on the computer, where I think maybe sometimes it gets in the way of imagination and really thinking through things. But where it can be useful is thinking about pacing, playback. Even better, have your music in front of you and try to hear it in your head and think about the pacing, sing it to yourself, conduct through it, whatever it is. Because a really important thing a composer needs to be able to do is to be able to step back out of this piece they've been obsessing over, and are so into. Somehow they need to step out of that box and observe the piece as an audience member, just hearing it for the first time. And that's a very hard thing to do. But by doing that, you can get a better sense of what the pacing actually is like.
I remember there is a clear discipline of not to put too much things in the beginning of the piece.
Right. I'm going there from the beginning of daylight into darkness, into the night. So the piece begins actually still in the dark because she's waking up in the morning and she's writing throughout the day. And so this morning, as she's talking about on the word light, things light up. But I wanted to just be just one voice in darkness. And it actually begins with them walking onto stage, singing Requiem. So I want it to be very ceremonial also.
So a lot of composers, young composers, they are pressured to filling with those flash chorus or passages for Shasik to impress the audiences. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a good thing, but how would you suggest to balance the authenticity and those virtuosity?
Yeah, well, concertos are, I think, meant to be virtuosic. But I think virtuosity has many different meanings. Like, yes, there is finger virtuosity, but there's also expressive virtuosity. There's virtuosity of color, right? Someone who is conveying many different colors. There's virtuosity of sound, the sound they're producing. Okay, so you can play fast, well, what's the sound you're making? You know, for me, I think I learned the most, and I actually teach a class here where I ask performers to teach the composers how to write for their instruments. And we do that through etudes. Clarinetist says, here's Jean-Jean, and here's what I practice. And you can see what I practice every day. In other words, what sounds very impressive and very virtuosic, but I practice all the time so I can do it, you know. These are the chords, these are the arpeggios, these are the scales. Most notated music, any note is a part of an arpeggio or part of a scale. So understanding how the instrument works, the etudes, you can learn a lot as a composer about what is the music they're always practicing and how can they convey virtuosity very directly that way.